Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, and welcome to NMAC's final webinar of the year for the HIV 50 Plus Strong and Healthy program. Thank you for joining, and before we get started, we're going to go over some housekeeping rules. When you join the webinar, your microphones were automatically muted to reduce feedback. If you have any questions or comments throughout the webinar, please type them in the chat box window. Myself and my colleague, Sable Nelson, will be helping monitor this throughout the webinar. We will try to give everyone 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to address questions. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be emailed to everyone who registered after the webinar. There is also a copy of the presentation attached to the handout section of the chat box window. Now I will hand it over to Dawn Abbott, founder of the WELL Project.
Thanks, Joanna. I am very pleased to be talking with you all today, although I wish I could see all of your beautiful faces. I would like to thank NMAC for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about both my personal experience and then sort of what I know to date. And I want to make it clear that my primary source of expertise is lived experience, and secondarily, there's a fair amount, frankly, of good information out there now, and I've just come from a meeting on all of this, so I'll share what I can with you, and then hopefully we'll have time for you to pose questions and for us to have more of a bit of a dialogue. So I've been asked to talk about women with HIV and aging-related health challenges, and I tried not to be too tongue-in-cheek about this, so I thought I would start by just giving you a little bit of background about my story and why I'm talking to you today, and a little bit about the Women's Research Initiative on HIV and AIDS, and most specifically the WRI 2019 that just happened this past week that focused very much on these issues. And then I think get in a little bit to what we know. And I think it's always nice to start off with the good news because it feels like so often when we're talking about HIV, and especially about women in HIV, we forget to start with the good news. So we'll do that and then talk a little bit about what we know about aging in women and in women with HIV specifically, and then what we don't know yet. And I suspect that we can all think of a laundry list of things that we don't know, but let's see what we can get through today. And then some opportunities in both research and policy going forward. And again, this will just be a small sampler. There's frankly an unlimited number of opportunities right now in both research and policy. And I hope that you will continue to query some of that and look for your ways to be a part of it. And then a couple of resources and then your questions. So without any further ado, let's get started. And let me start by just giving you a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you today. I was diagnosed with HIV in 1988 when I was 19 years old. And so for a number of years, I thought I represented the youth infected with HIV. And then sometime in my early 30s, when somebody said, we're looking for somebody who's, can really understand the youth experience and represent youth to talk about HIV. And I said, well, I guess that might be me. And they all turned around and looked at me with one eyebrow up and said, sorry, you've passed that point now. So today, I get to represent women who are aging, and I'm really pleased to say that because in 1988, when I was diagnosed, probably like some of you on the phone, my life expectancy was about 6 months based on what we knew at the time, and I didn't know another woman in the world with HIV, and it was just a really different time and a different picture than it is today. So fast forward, I spent the first 6 or 7 years of after my HIV diagnosis being quiet. My doctor told me not to read anything. It was too confusing and not to tell anyone because it could really mess with my family's life. My brothers might get kicked out of school. We lived in Stone Mountain, Georgia, by the way. And, my dad might lose his job or my family might lose our insurance. There were a lot of kind of big, heavy things weighing on my HIV diagnosis. So I spent those first few years keeping it a secret and finishing college and going to work in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill with this, terrifying secret that I was hiding about HIV. Back in those early 90s, I don't know if you remember these days that well, but it was a time when then newly elected President Bill Clinton was battling with Congress over allowing gays in the military. And his biggest opponent was Senator Sam Nunn, who was the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I was working for Sam Nunn. And what happened in those days were there were a lot of early actions by ACT UP and Queer Nation and other advocacy groups who showed up in our office with, fake vials of blood, and they were shaking them in my face and saying, "You're a bigot, you hate people with AIDS." And I was saying, no, you don't understand, I'm not afraid of you. But I couldn't tell anybody that I had HIV at that time, or I didn't think I could. A couple of years of that was all it took, and I was one of the very fortunate ones to have a family who knew that I was HIV positive because my parents were with me when I was diagnosed. And, they were willing for me to start to be a little more public. And so I got my first job working as the treatment resource specialist at the AIDS Survival Project in Atlanta, Georgia. And I didn't know then what that was going to mean for the rest of my life. But from the time that I transitioned into working in that organization and started meeting other people living with HIV and eventually other women living with HIV, it became clear to me that my passion was in the treatment and the science and doing what we could to both manage this disease and ultimately cure it. And so in 2004, I wrote my first grant to fund an organization called WISE, which stood for Women's Information Service and Exchange. And we were the first organization that I'm aware of in the country to focus specifically on treatment information and treatment advocacy for women. And if you think back, 1994 was just as we were doing the phase 3 studies and the really pivotal research on the first round of protease inhibitors. So it was a huge kind of seismic shift in our understanding around HIV at that time, and an extraordinarily important time for me as a positive woman in her 20s, trying to make my way in the world. And so WISE was funded, and I got on my first clinical trial, and despite having 75 T cells and a viral load of 750,000 at the time, I was able to identify some studies that I was interested in and get on one of the early protease studies and really turn things around for me. So leapfrog forward, I spent a year when I turned 30 hiking the Appalachian Trail, because as a 19-year-old turning 30 was like if the world was flat, 30 was the edge. And I was discovering that it wasn't actually the edge, that I still had a life to live. And after that, I launched the Well Project, and that is still going today, and I'm extraordinarily proud of the work we did in the early days to get it started. And now I can take very little credit because there's an extraordinary executive director and team, not to mention the women who blog For a Girl Like Me and the work that we do with the WRI. So in December of this past year, I turned 50. So I am coming up on the 31st anniversary of my HIV diagnosis. And it has been a pretty epic journey. I'm proud to say I just recently received my AARP card in the mail, which seems like one of those far-off goals just a decade ago. So the other piece of my story that's, I think, relevant to this conversation is that one of the things that I did not believe could happen when I was first diagnosed was I didn't think I was going to be able to have children. And that was an incredibly important thing for me, and probably the most devastating part of my diagnosis, because I think mortality was kind of not something I could wrap my head around, but not being able to have children was really devastating in a lot of ways. And I'm pleased to say that I have three daughters. The first born in 2002, then 2004, and now I have a little 3-year-old, just to remind me how young 50 really is. So that's a little bit about me, and I think that context will hopefully give you a sense of kind of the range of things that I'd like to talk about, both from personal experience, but more importantly, to what we know and where we've come to since the early days in this fight, and then hear what you want to talk about. So one of the things that I launched just after the Well Project was actually just as the Well Project was coming online in the web portal was something that was then referred to as a Women in HIV think tank, but has now evolved into the Women's Research Initiative on HIV and AIDS. And we just had our 15th WRI just last weekend. And our focus on at this WRI was women living with HIV over the long term and across the lifespan. And when NMAC called me back in the fall and said, would you be willing to do one on women and aging? I said, wait till after WRI. I know that there's going to be so much that comes out of that. And I think that was a great choice. I want to be clear that when we chose to focus on this topic at WRI, from my perspective, we really need to think about kind of HIV as a piece of living with HIV over the long term, and really be aware of the fact that there are young women who've been living with HIV because they were either perinatally infected or infected at a very young age, and who have also been living with HIV for 30 years. So it's important for us to think about what it means to have HIV disease over a very long period of time, regardless of your age. And then, of course, for many of us, it's the issue of what does that look like overlaid with the issues around aging. And, ultimately, we're all working really hard to age at this point. So it's something that I think we can be proud of, but it is different than living with HIV just over the long term. So at this WRI, we focus both on the aging piece, but also on what it is for perinatally infected young women who are kind of becoming young mothers and making their way in the world in their 20s and 30s to think about long-term HIV disease. And I'm happy to take questions about that. You'll see a couple of slides folded in here from that meeting as we go through. And I apologize, I've sort of lost my voice, which makes it a little unfortunate for a webinar, but I hope you're able to hear me okay. So I said I wanted to start off with the good news, and so this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is that women do live longer than men. There is some concern, unfortunately, that HIV may actually be the game changer in that, and to date, that women with HIV may not live longer than men. But I think that we're going to start to see that change and evolve as we start to understand more about long-term HIV disease and move away from managing HIV as just a chronic, as an acute condition where we were just, frankly, in the early days with treatment, we were just trying to keep people alive for a year or 2 years or 5 years. And now we've really moved to a much more chronic disease model. And I think that as we start to shift our thinking around how we manage HIV on the background of all the other things that are going on in our lives, we're going to start to see some of this turn around. The graph on the right is just life expectancy at birth in the United States, and this is not about HIV. This is just in general, just to remind us that we actually might even have the upper hand in this one. So I continue to believe that we can get to that place with HIV as well. So I wanted to take just a minute as a level set, because I think one of the things that is hard is for many of us, especially if you're over 50, you may or may not be working and or recently retired, and you may or may not be partnered. Something about being a person over 50 and kind of knowing who you are in the world makes it also a little alienating, I think, for some, especially for women, but for people over 50 in general. And we have to really kind of recognize that actually we are a significant and growing part of the epidemic. And so these numbers are from CDC, and unfortunately, of course, they're a couple of years behind as surveillance data always is. But this is really showing us that in 2015, fully 45% of people living with HIV, and that means having had it, not just being diagnosed in 2015, but having been diagnosed over time, are over 50 years old. So, and we see that number actually beginning to grow. Let's see. But so now to be more specific, if you take a closer look and you're thinking just about women, women represent somewhere between 23 and 25% of all people living with HIV in the U.S., but greater than, and probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% are greater than 45 years. So from the last graph, which was really showing men and women diagnosed with HIV, now we're really talking about women specifically. There are more women over 45 years than men living with HIV today. And this is a breakdown by race, by Blacks, Latina, and white. And as you can see, Black women have and continue to overwhelmingly be impacted by HIV and carry the disease burden. You start to see some growing numbers as you get older with both white women and Latinas. So what do we know about aging with HIV? This is tricky because there's data that conflicts. So in some realms, we see data that suggests that there's just this growing list of comorbidities or additional diseases and burdens that people with HIV are experiencing, and then others where they show some positive little bits of information. So I put on here increased risks for the HIV positive as compared to HIV negative population. This is really thinking both men and women, but some pieces of this are clearly things that we're seeing more prevalence in women. The good news is that although we see increased cardiovascular disease, there have actually been some recent studies that have shown that certain manifestations are not more significant for women with HIV than for women who are not living with HIV. But overall, women seem to be significantly impacted by the risk of cardiovascular disease in a variety of different forms. So we're going to come back to that a little bit because as we start to put all of these pieces together, it starts to tie into our understanding of what's happening in menopause and as we age. And some of these things are risks that the general population has already, and some are exacerbated or made worse, of course, by HIV disease, at least as we see it right now. Bone density loss, and I coupled it with frailty, but frailty really has shown up in terms of fracture rates. So people ending up with broken bones and fractures at a much higher level than the general population, and also in some cases 5 to 10 years earlier than the general population. So this is, of course, a huge call out for nutrition, stress management, and exercise, keeping our bodies moving, even if it's just walking up your stairs or just walking around your block or just keeping your body moving at intervals. All of those things seem to really help with our bone health and frailty. Cancers also are showing up. And I think that this is another reminder that in all of this, we have to keep in mind that HIV and infectious disease specialists have been very, very focused specifically on the virus. And they're kind of trying to play catch up in the management of all of these things that may actually occur for us as we age. So making sure that your care team is well-rounded, that you think about asking questions if you've kind of timed out and you're not seeing a GYN, a gynecologist, as often anymore, circling back so that people are kind of picking up all the rocks and looking underneath to really think about what might be going on for you, because we clearly know that some of these manifestations may be about HIV, some of them may be about long-term use of the HIV medicines or the antiretroviral agents, others may be specifically related to age, and so on and so on. So kind of teasing out what's at work is really part of what we're doing right now. Sadly and unfortunately, there's an increased risk of stroke. We saw that in the ALERT study, and this is something that we all need to be aware of. The signs for women that you're having either a stroke or a heart-related cardiovascular event are different than men, and so that's something that talking to a provider and saying, listen, can you help me understand what I should be thinking about or looking out for, so that I don't just dismiss it as another bad day or some little nuisance. That's really an important thing for us to kind of keep in mind. Metabolic markers and weight gain. And weight gain has a whole new kind of focus today based on some of the research and the reports coming out of the recent retrovirus conference about increased weight gain specifically on integrase inhibitors. And that, I think, is particularly confounded. It was seen most predominantly in women and in Black women specifically. But there's a lot to be teased out there. That is when you break it down, you figure out that for women who perhaps already started a little bit on the heavy side, that seems to be a greater potential increase, and we're unclear right now what's at play there. So there's a lot of work going on that. And finally, neurocognitive disorders. The mental health related issues and challenges for people with HIV are no mystery to most of us, but there are things that we're starting to see over time. And you've probably heard people talk about one of the challenges with HIV and aging is kind of capacity to either short-term memory loss, to concentrate, struggles with depression or anxiety or other things like that. And some studies that were done a number of years ago that showed that people who have been living with HIV for a long term and were progressing with the disease saw some decreased mental acuity or functioning. So they, at 50, were functioning like 70-year-olds. I would be careful about how much weight we put in on that at this point, except for where it's used to kind of motivate and encourage us to be doing things that help keep us healthy and well. So I think that we have, again, this kind of jumbled up environment where we have HIV and long-term HIV for many. We have aging in and of itself, and for women, and that also for most women will involve going through menopause and or gonadal aging, maturation. And then we have the use of these treatments that many of us have been using for a number of years. I now have kind of half jokingly introduced myself as a long-term survivor of protease inhibitors because I started on an early protease study in 1994 and was on some kind of protease-containing regimen for 18 years. So I realized that when I'm trying to sort out things that are going on for me personally, I have to really look at all of the different variables that are at play. And I don't know if it's just HIV or if it's long-term exposure to the medication, or if it's the fact that I'm aging or some other kind of environmental factor going on in my life at the moment. So that's an important thing to think about. This slide, I just wanted to call out that the Office of AIDS Research has taken some of this pretty seriously, and has recently put out a notice that, by the year 2030, 84% of the HIV population will have more than one comorbidity. And what that means is basically there will be HIV and something else. And that number actually goes up pretty significantly. Almost 30% will have greater than 3 comorbidities. Again, kind of complicating the picture significantly as we try to figure out what exactly people are dealing with. And, this number is particularly scary to me and something that we need to pay a lot of attention to, which is 78% of patients will be diagnosed with some kind of cardiovascular disease. And, that's kind of a sobering number if you think about it. And this is a case where we can really say there's a significant difference for people with HIV, because they're saying that this will be 30% higher than the general population. So again, thinking about heart health and nutrition and exercise and well-being is all going to be very critical for us going forward. So this is a piece that we really focused on the WRI, and I felt like, although this is a busy and a lot of information on it, I think it's worthwhile calling this out, which is, although in clinical trials there are often quality of life questionnaires and tools used to assess, how you do in your day-to-day functioning, we haven't yet, as far as I am aware, really developed tools that help us kind of hone in on our lived experience. So from the chart and the paper review, if somebody looked at me, they would say, I have 1,000 T cells and viral load is undetectable, and, everything looks great and we have nothing to worry about. But if you're only looking at the numbers, you're only getting a piece of the picture. And this data was really fascinating to me, that psychosocial factors other than HIV may be as important or more important determinants of neurocognitive impairment in women. And, I think that is both, again, a little bit scary, but also somewhat empowering. If we start to deal with trauma, if we start to deal with stressors to the best of our ability, and we take into consideration what's actually going on for a whole person, then we're, I think, likely to be much more effective in managing both HIV over the long term, but also keeping people healthy and well. And so, this list is pretty long. Psychosocial stressors, I can't imagine that many of us don't have at least a few of these to check off. And some of you probably can check off most of them. And that, I think, is not insignificant. It's not an asterisk at the bottom of the page. It's really, I think, a front and center piece of what we've got to start dealing with today. So everything from early life trauma and food insecurity, as well as housing, and then, of course, HIV-related stressors, which is, this is very real. Sadness and grief from initial diagnosis. Many, many, many of us kind of put it on the back burner for a while. You might have been diagnosed and really not kind of really fully embraced that diagnosis and began to engage in care and get involved in any way for years after an initial diagnosis. So even if you've been diagnosed for a very long time, or you see somebody or care for someone who has, it doesn't mean that the sadness and grief from the initial diagnosis is past. So this stuff is really, really important. And I think that internalized stigma plays a role that is something that we continue to struggle with. When people say to me, wow, it's a really different world now than it was in 1988 when you were diagnosed, the answer to that is yes and no. And the yes is, it is a really different world. We have, when I was diagnosed in 1988, we had one drug. It was AZT, and we used it all wrong. And it was, there were a lot of things about that time that were very dire. That said, being diagnosed in 2019 in this volatile and crazy political environment we currently live in, and in a world where everyone thinks, oh, HIV is a chronic manageable disease, you can just kind of deal with it, totally delegitimizes the experience of that diagnosis, I think, and in some ways causes internalized stigma to be far more significant. So whereas community stigma may have been greater in 1988, I think internalized stigma is enormous today and something that we really have to pay attention to. So I think what was really important about this slide was that all of these pieces led to greater rates of depression. So women living with HIV had 20% prevalence of major depressive disorder versus 10% nationally. And that's a striking difference. And similarly, 32% reported this major depressive disorder over their lifetime. So sometime in your life having what is termed a major depressive disorder. And that, these things all seem to lead to a significantly higher rate of neurocognitive impairment. So stress, anxiety, trauma, sadness, grief, depression, these are all real things, and they're real. They truly impact our health and well-being, and kind of treating them as something that lives on the side is a mistake. So I think we're going to see a big push to move towards really managing HIV and the lived experience in a far more significant way. So I feel like we can't have this conversation without just kind of touching on menopause for a minute. I think one of the things that happens in a lot of the conversations I have with other women around menopause is an oversimplification of what menopause actually is, and a belief that, in fact, you aren't in menopause until you don't have a period anymore, and then you're in menopause and ta-da, you've arrived. For those of you who are walking a mile in that shoe right now, as I am, it doesn't actually happen overnight. And in fact, it's a process that happens over years, and for some, even a decade. So being aware of changes that are happening over time is really important, and continuing to ask providers to kind of pay attention to those things and reminding them that this piece exists is a really important part. I think there are trade-offs for menopause. I mean, I personally, with 3 daughters, have gone through 2 of them, beginning the great adventure of starting their periods, and on one hand saying, yay, congratulations, and on the other hand thinking quietly to myself, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for the last 38 years, I want to be done. So I don't know how you all feel, but I know other women who feel similarly. So the good news is eventually no period. Unfortunately, there's some real trade-offs with not having a menstrual cycle in a regular schedule anymore. And there are certainly systemic changes, and so many of the things that we have talked about so far on these lists have been impacted or could be impacted by menopause, and also by hormonal changes that happen. And weight gain is a part of that. We know that. The possibility that inflammation is actually exacerbated in menopause is something that we're trying to understand now. And in the general population, we see, and we continue to see in HIV, increased risk of diabetes, heart disease, and these neurocognitive impairments that we've been talking about. So I love this slide because I think it begins to put everything in the soup here, and begin to drill down to some of what might be, what all of these things might actually be impacting. And increasingly, the attention to the role of inflammation in our bodies is more and more and more important. And the possibility that persistent inflammation may be a driver of some of these aging-associated morbidity challenges, even when you're, virally suppressed, is I think really important for us to look at. So I think we talked about HIV, obviously other co-infections. HCV co-infection is just one example. Diabetes and others, lifestyle, what you go into the picture with, and then increasingly, I think we're starting to really pay attention to the impact of stress on inflammation, and then of course gonadal aging, moving through menopause, and what all of these things have to do with our body's ability to deal with cancer, heart disease, mental health related issues, and so on. So stay tuned. I think we're going to learn a lot more about inflammation over the coming years, and we're really looking at what we can do to manage that inflammation piece. So I'm just going to kind of wrap up because I really want to make sure that there's time for questions. And talk a little bit about the opportunities in research and policy. And again, a lot of this is coming out of having spent this past weekend or this past coming out of a 3.5-day or 3-day meeting with academics and folks from industry and from government and the researchers, many of whom we all know and love, and community and a significant number of positive women, and all sitting in the same room talking about the things that are really impacting our lives and what we need to understand more. And one of them we just covered on, which is this more robust measuring of lived experience. So one of the things the group talked about was really looking at the various quality of life measures and other tools that are used in research to make sure that we're really capturing that information. And thinking about how we can incorporate that into really understanding the results that come out of these studies beyond the surrogate markers we use to assess how things work or how people are doing. The other thing that came up in a really significant way in this meeting was the End the Epidemic campaign and movement. Many of you are probably aware that the current administration has made a goal of ending the HIV epidemic in the U.S. by 2030. And so that's really falling to some of the agencies, the CDC and Health and Human Services and others to really figure out how to operationalize that. The good news is we have some significant allies in those places, and but our voices need to be heard in this process. One of the things that came out at our meeting last week was women's concern that ending the epidemic means getting rid of new HIV infections, but what does it do for those of us who are living with HIV today and tomorrow and the next day, hopefully? And a lot of conversations about the HIV, the safety net and the wraparound services that many of our organizations and programs are struggling to continue to provide, and how important those are with dealing with all of these lived experience issues that we've just addressed. So development and building out at the End the Epidemic campaign and work is something that our voices need to be a part of and to be and we need to be engaged in some way, because it really does have an impact not only on those who we would like to help keep from getting HIV disease, but also for those of us who already have it. Another thing that came up was involvement of women across the lifespan in clinical trials, and really making sure that we hold researchers and research sponsors' feet to the fire and make sure that we're actually looking at issues both that impact our lives as women living over 50, and also what information we need to know when they do research on new treatments, and as we follow up on the various conditions, so that we really are answering questions for what is now a very significant and soon perhaps to be the majority of the population of women living with HIV going forward. So there is also a lot of interest in understanding this weight gain phenomenon and the associated risks, because it's not just about vanity. It could also put people at increased risk with diabetes and also cardiovascular disease and other things. So what is actually happening? And for those of you who've been around for a while, you'll remember in the late 90s, it was lipodystrophy and body composition changes when that started to hit the scene. At first, there was a little bit of this, don't worry, that's just a cosmetic problem. And so for many of us, there's a bit of a Groundhog Day experience with this new weight gain issue. And, you know, people are really kind of saying, no, we need to understand this. This is relevant. So that's another one. And then going back to the lived experience, adoption of trauma-informed care as standard of care, as a way that, you know, we should be receiving care in places where the assumption is everyone has got some level of trauma or other grief, depression, anxiety, other things going on in their lives that may be impacting their care, and not making trauma-informed care be a specialized thing for the unique patient, because that's most of us or all of us. And then the role of inflammation we talked about, and then we always want to mention that we're still interested in seeing how we develop cure research so that it answers the questions we need answered as we move down that road. Obviously, there's a bunch more, and I imagine a number of you on the phone have suggestions or ideas or thoughts about research and policy, but know that your voice and your engagement, even if it's just keeping up on the information or sharing it with one other, all the way to making calls to your senators. We actually had a really interesting piece of feedback from some of our colleagues who do a lot of policy work, saying that the impact of our letter campaigns and emails and things like that is good, but the thing that gets counted is our phone calls. And in our world where so many of us just do things that involve typing, I think it's important to know that picking up the phone and calling your representative or your senator, or just setting something up for once a week to make a quick call about whatever the issue, those things are counted and those calls are counted, so they'll be paying attention. So I think with that, I just wanted to make sure, obviously, and the Well Project is the organization that I founded and am so grateful for. There's an aging and HIV info sheet on the Well Project web portal, but there are well over 100, I think 110 or so info sheets on the Well Project site, covering a whole host of issues. So if you need more information, it's a good resource, and can also send you to other resources. In addition, there's the A Girl Like Me blog. If you're not familiar with it, it's positive women sharing their stories and experiences, and some really amazing things have come out of that. So, and also even as simple as doing an HIV.gov search for HIV and aging, there's a number of links with bits of information. And we will be issuing a WRI issue brief very shortly, so following up on this meeting. And hopefully you will tap into that as well. So I think with that, I already talked longer than I intended. So thank you for your attention. And Joanna, why don't we get some questions going?
Yes, thank you, Dawn. So we have a couple of comments and then I think maybe one question so far. So Lapina Reed says, just thank you for sharing your journey. Alexa Rodriguez says that I will add immigration status and being transgender woman. Life expectancy in a transgender woman is 35 years. And then
excellent.
And then from Jules Levin, it is very well accepted along with many studies reporting that HIV positive experience generally premature and more often comorbidities, but it seems you are saying that's not true.
Actually, I'm not saying, hi, Jules. I'm not saying that that's not true. What I'm saying is that there is some data now that suggests that in some cases, we don't see accelerated aging. And I think that there was something that just came out of WISE on that. So we weren't seeing it in, depending on what you're looking at, what you're measuring. But I think overall, obviously, we talked about things happening earlier for people with HIV, so some things happening 5 to 10 years earlier based on some of the data that we have seen. And I think that we should be careful not, if the message that came across from what I was saying was that don't worry about it, it doesn't happen. That's not what I intended for you to hear. What I intended for you to hear is there are some little pieces of light at the end of the tunnel here, but there are a lot of ways in which obviously HIV, long-term antiretroviral use, and aging are confounding issues that cause people with HIV, and specifically women with HIV, challenges earlier.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have for now, but I'll give anyone couple more minutes if they're in the middle of typing their question.
Just while they're typing or while we're waiting to see if there's anything additionally, I want to just go back to your second point, which is the issue about both immigration and trans women, which I think is extraordinarily important. I'm pleased to say that at WRI, both of there was a trans woman and a woman who was also representing women who are dealing with immigration challenges, both at the table, and we talked a lot about the challenges, and a lot of that came out in our lived experience piece, and know that we are going to be paying very close attention to life expectancy and challenges for all women, trans women included.
Thank you. And we have a comment from Vicki Lynn. She says, "Thank you. Your presentation was amazing, and I'm so grateful to know you. Thank you for all you do and your commitment to improving the lives of women living with HIV worldwide." And then we have a question from Judith Shaw. She says, "I'm a 62-year-old Black woman living with HIV, and I have concerns about what the aging of HIV looks like for the aging community. Are geriatricians being trained to handle the aging population? Because the truth being told, it has gone far beyond just aging with HIV, and our nursing centers having these conversations." Don, did you hear my question? Hi, Don, did you hear my question? Don?
My apologies, I'm back.
Oh, okay. Did you hear my questions, or do you want me to read it again?
Would you read it again, please?
Sure. "I'm a 62-year-old Black woman living with HIV, and I have concerns around what the aging with HIV looks like for the aging community. Are geriatricians being trained to handle the aging population? Because the truth being told, it has gone far beyond just aging with HIV. Are nursing centers having these conversations as well?"
That's a great question. And I think the short answer is no. People are trying to get up to speed. And I think it depends on where you get your care. But certainly some centers are focused on aging and aging-related issues. But the vast majority of geriatric treaters are not really ready to manage HIV, and the challenge is that the data is also all over the place. We have limited bits and pieces, and we're trying to put those pieces together. So that is why one of the recommendations I would have is, to the extent that you can, depending on where you get your care, you can engage a multidisciplinary team. So that means asking your primary care doctor to see some of the specialists who might be both aware of HIV but also aware of issues specifically to the geriatric population. And then I think don't underestimate the importance of getting a gynecologist involved as well. So I think that there's, right now we're still kind of taping these pieces together in a lot of places around the country. There are a number of studies ongoing, but they take time, and unfortunately, we don't have all of the answers. And I think it's really important for us as HIV positive women to advocate for ourselves and to say, listen, I need somebody who knows about this piece of this to kind of influence what we're thinking here. So don't give up. There's a lot of information being generated right now, and there are the WISE cohort is really looking at everything that they have in a pretty deep way right now to kind of figure out what can be pulled out of what's already the data that's already available.
Great, thank you. So we have one more question from Cynthia Taylor. Thank you for having this webinar. My name is Cynthia Taylor, and my question is, how do women deal with menopause problems? Not just young women, but older women with so much medical problems.
Yeah, boy, that's the million-dollar question. How do women deal with menopause? That answer is, of course, all over the place. But I think for many years, literally 25 years ago, we were having conversations about whether or not there was early menopause in women with HIV or changes in the menstrual cycle if you had HIV. And the studies were literally split down the middle. Half said yes, half said no. And so it was always a stumbling block for us in kind of determining what role HIV might play, not to mention other conditions, other medications, et cetera, on changes in menstruation. Interestingly, there's more information, I think, being generated as we move towards menopause. And I think that, for most of us, it kind of sneaks up. Menopause for me, and maybe I should just speak from my personal experience, feels very much like a bit of a sneak attack. I feel like I've been standing there looking for it, but it's probably been, early menopause has been going on now for a couple of years, and I just thought they were, other environmental factors impacting what was going on in my body. So it's not just about whether or not you've got hot flashes or you're crabby or your period is regular. There are other things that begin to manifest. Some women describe vaginal dryness and either a radical change in sex drive, either mostly kind of less libido, but some say more. And, that can all happen, while periods are happening at a relatively regular clip. So it's a little bit hard, I think, for us to really wrap our heads around the full range of things that go on in menopause, which is part of the reason for really encouraging everyone to consider talking to someone who focuses on women's health and or a gynecologist about what to be looking for and what to expect.
Great. And then this is a question from Lapina Reed. Are there clinical trials regarding weight gain and inflammation?
There are clinical trials. There right now, I think, a number of studies trying to do analyses on the studies that they already, the data they've already collected. There were actually, I don't know what the number of, but there were quite a number of papers and discussions at the Conference on Retroviruses and Opportunistic Infections that happened in the beginning of March. And I think that because this issue is really starting to come up a great deal, I think we at the Well Project will talk a little bit about what we can provide. I don't know if NATAP and Jules group has done anything on the weight gain thing or not, but that's another place you should consider checking out. In terms of getting on a prospective studies that are going to be looking at that, I think what's going to happen is they're going to be largely in treatment trials. There's going to be a fair amount of both anthropomorphic measures, so kind of doing things like measuring hip circumference and waist circumference and BMI, body mass index, and things like that to kind of assess whether or not the changes are happening because of some metabolic issue, or are we actually seeing weight gain happen because of related depression, sadness, anxiety, mental health related changes that are causing different behaviors. So a lot of this is up in the air right now, but there are a number of studies that are going to be looking at it, and you can look at clinicaltrials.gov, which is a little hard to tease out, but there will be studies coming down the road here shortly. In terms of inflammation, inflammation often gets written into a lot of the research that's being done, especially on the currently being developed, the drugs that are currently in development. And then there are inflammation-specific studies as well. So again, clinicaltrials.gov, if you look at inflammation in HIV, and it should pull up some options for you to look at.
Thank you, Dawn. So I have another statement from Judith. She says, in my community, I'm doing gathering of bringing folks together because LPS and the aging are lonely, and this causes folks to find themselves in unhealthy, risky relationships.
So true. I think we underestimate what it's like to live with HIV for a really long time. I think that there are increasingly groups that are coming together for long-term survivors, and there's a lot of conversation in the community about what it means to go from having what for some of us was called a terminal illness or a fatal disease in the 80s and 90s to, a chronic illness, and how you shape your thinking and engage in the community in a way that feels good to you. So kudos to you, Judith, for doing that work. It's really important work, and we should all remember to reach out to each other as often as we can.
Thank you. And Vicki Lynn just posted an article in the chat box window from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases that's helpful for some HIV-related immune activation. The headline reads, HIV-related immune activation may predict weight gain and exacerbate complications, especially in women. So if anyone has time, feel free to click on that link.
Shout out to Vicki Lynn, who's a blogger on A Girl Like Me and a part of the Well Project advisory group. So she's an awesome voice.
All right. I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Dawn, so much for presenting on this webinar. It was really interesting. I hope everyone has a great weekend. We hope to see many of you guys at USDA in September.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.